Hello, I'm Jim McIntyre, Regional Communications Director for the American Red Cross of Northern Ohio, and welcome to the new season of the Be a Hero podcast, which you can also view on YouTube and on our Vimeo channel. For this episode, it will especially be worthwhile to watch because we'll be displaying some photos taken during responses to disasters throughout 2023 in the Northern Ohio region and across the country. We'll be joined by Emily Probst, the Regional Disaster Officer for the Northern Ohio Red Cross, and our CEO, Mike Parks, both of who, along with yours truly, responded to the terrible wildfires in Hawaii. And we'll hear from one of our volunteers who always seems to be helping at one disaster or another. Rebecca Siedler will join us. But first, we're going to set up just how much disasters have increased and intensified over the last 20 years.
The climate crisis is upending millions of lives across the country and around the globe. We are witnessing a striking number of natural disasters with greater severity than ever before. In fact, the number of billion-dollar disasters in the U.S. has increased by 70% over the past decade. The number of families affected will continue to rise in both volume and suffering. However, these disasters leave their most profound mark on low-income communities, as well as those who are older or living with disabilities. The people most impacted by climate disasters are already the most vulnerable. The devastation has a compounding effect on these communities, and we need your help in the face of this humanitarian crisis. Your support is critical and will help the American Red Cross remain at the front lines to provide aid as disasters intensify. As a leading disaster responder in the U.S., we're launching nearly twice as many relief operations than we did a decade ago in response to unrelenting and overlapping disasters. And sadly, many of the same communities are ravaged repeatedly. This crisis has stretched our ability to provide life-saving meals, shelter, health and mental health services, financial aid, and more to people with no place else to go. That's why we're expanding our capacity to deliver emergency aid, enhancing our large-scale relief and recovery services, using innovation where we can, and growing partner support networks in disaster-prone communities. Internationally, we're implementing new programs to reduce climate disaster risks in some of the most vulnerable high-population areas. We're also creating grassroots pre-disaster plans and engaging with youth leaders to expand their local impact. We each play a role in responding to this crisis, so at the American Red Cross, we are also doing our part to reduce our own environmental footprint through cutting emissions, waste, and water use. Even with all of these efforts combined, we need to do more. With your help, the American Red Cross will invest $1.1 billion over the next 5 years to meet the growing needs of this humanitarian crisis. Your commitment ensures we can continue to help those who need it most.
Here are some takeaways from that video. In the last 10 years, the number of billion-dollar disasters has increased 70%. Between 2003 and 2012, we responded to 89 disasters that caused $1 billion damage or more. Between 2013 and 2022, $152 billion disasters. In the last 10 years, more than 8.5 million people were forced from their homes. In the past 5 years, more Category 4 and 5 hurricanes have made landfall than in the previous 50 years combined. And nearly twice as many relief operations for major disasters are launched now versus just a decade ago. Mike Parks is the regional CEO of the American Red Cross of Northern Ohio. And Mike, you meet with disaster management officials, you hear about the challenges caused by the climate crisis. Give us your thoughts about the need for the Red Cross to adapt to these challenges?
Well, thank you, Jim. And I think the video you just shared paints a very clear picture, a certainly troubling picture, of there's never been a greater need for the American Red Cross to be available to support people all over our country and all over actually the world as we deal with these ongoing challenges. I know that there are a lot of different examples of how this has increased over the years. One that I kind of refer to that really has captured it for me is that 40 years ago, we experienced $3 billion disasters every year, every 120 days. Today, adjusted for inflation, that number is a six-fold increase. We experience a $1 billion disaster every 20 days. That is why the Red Cross is putting such an emphasis on finding ways to help these communities that have been hit over and over again, these vulnerable communities. So our effort is to try to also help with long-term recovery efforts in those communities. So the organization, the Red Cross, has taken it upon ourselves to identify those communities that are the hardest hit, and most vulnerable, and most frequently hit. And we are putting recovery specialists in housing, health, and hunger in those very, very communities to try to help sustain a long-term recovery, to help those communities and those people impacted, survive and thrive once again, so that they're not as susceptible and so vulnerable to the next storm, which we know is coming.
Well, we in Northern Ohio are fortunate in that we're not so prone to weather-related disasters. And in fact, two of the largest disaster responses in 2023 were of the man-made variety. Let's bring in Emily Probst, the Regional Disaster Officer in Northern Ohio. Hi, Emily.
Hi, guys. Happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. You were working in a different capacity for the Red Cross last February when a train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. At that time, the Red Cross set up a shelter for residents who were forced to evacuate. And volunteers got out of bed late on a Friday night to make sure people had a safe place to stay. Can you give us a little bit more information about that disaster response, Em?
Absolutely. So as you said, we did receive that call late on a Friday night. Around 11 p.m., we get that call stating that there's an evacuation in East Palestine due to a train that derailed. And we were quickly able to mobilize and work to set up a shelter. Our response time, we actually had people within 2 hours of that call on scene, passing out comfort items and blankets to the residents that were being asked to evacuate their homes. And we ran that shelter for several days while that evacuation order was in place to ensure that residents had somewhere safe and dry to stay. We served them meals to ensure that they were fed. And once that evacuation order was lifted, all of our clients that were staying with us did proceed to go back to their homes. And we were able to work with community partners to make sure that they were connected with the needs that they needed before we left.
I was there a couple of times, Emily, and I got to tell you that that was one successful operation. They worked like a machine, making sure that those people in East Palestine who had to stay there had a safe place to stay, meals to eat, and the comfort that they needed. Congratulations to our disaster staff, most of whom were volunteers. And at that time, it was the longest running shelter operation in Northern Ohio in recent memory at 5 days and 4 nights. Little did we know that just a few months later, that would be eclipsed by yet another man-made disaster in the city of East Cleveland. But on the night before the 4th of July holiday, the Terrace Towers apartment building lost power, forcing residents to flee, first to the Salvation Army facility in East Cleveland, and then to a dormitory on the campus of Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. And Emily, by then you were the regional disaster officer and fully involved in that operation. Talk about it a little bit.
Yes, so we did receive that call that there was a fire at the Terrace Towers building, and our emergency management agency was reaching out to us for support to provide emergency sheltering for residents while it was determined if they would be able to regain entry into that building. Again, we quickly mobilized to be able to provide those services, and shout out to our amazing Northern Ohio disaster volunteers. There were so many people that stepped up that first day and then continued to step up for a week's time to support the needs of our residents. So we did initially set up at the Salvation Army, and then due to circumstances within their building, we worked together with the Salvation Army and other partners like the RTA and Case Western to relocate our shelter to Case Western Reserve, where we remained open while the property management worked to identify locations for all of their residents to be relocated. And during that time, we again provided comfort items. We provided needs such as health services, mental health needs, spiritual care requests. And we just continued to work with our residents to identify any potential needs that they might have. And if we couldn't provide them, working really closely with our community partners to see how we can do that. And just from all the photos, if you're watching online, as you see them come through, you can see how many different people were involved, and we could not do what we do without our volunteers. They were amazing, and we're greatly appreciative to them.
I bet this is bringing back some memories for Rebecca Siedler, who was also involved in this operation.
I'm sure it is.
Let's bring Rebecca on. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
Thank you very much for responding as a Red Cross volunteer and for joining us today. So, how long have you been volunteering for the Red Cross, Rebecca?
I just finished my 4th year.
Oh, and what is your role as a volunteer for the Red Cross?
I'm a DAT responder, so I respond to quite a few fires. I do sheltering and feeding.
DAT means Disaster Action Team.
Yes.
And have you been on a disaster response any bigger than Terrace Towers?
No.
What did you do there?
I did mostly feeding while I was there, and then just listening to the clients and hearing their stories and letting them know, that we were there, just answering questions that they had and stuff like that.
There were more than 100 people who were sheltered at that dormitory, and you and the rest of the Red Cross staff made sure that nobody likes to be out of their home, especially during a holiday weekend. And you gave up your holiday weekend as well to make sure that these folks were kept safe and well fed and had the emotional support they needed. So thank you for that.
No problem.
But that wasn't the end of it, though. Severe storms we do have weather in Northern Ohio. And severe storms caused damaging flooding to several areas of Northern Ohio in August. Erie County seemed to be the hardest hit. The Red Cross set up a shelter in Sandusky to house anyone who needed to take refuge there. There was one other shelter set up elsewhere in the region. Emily, you can talk about that.
Yes. So the flooding that happened in August was quite extensive across our entire region, actually. So we opened cases in 13 total of our counties, which for a larger operation is definitely something that was new to Northern Ohio, but so proud of how the team was able to mobilize and work together. Not just disaster services, everybody really stepped up to help. Mainly areas that were hit were Cuyahoga, Erie, Lorain, and Monroe. And we did have a shelter that opened in Monroe, Michigan, as well as Jim mentioned, in Erie to help in the Sandusky area for those that needed refuge from that flooding. And so our teams worked really hard to go out into the community, doing lots of damage assessment, and really opening cases for people who were able to kind of qualify for that Red Cross assistance. And even for people that we weren't able to open cases for, we were able to get them connected with a lot of community partners and community resources, as well as provide things like cleanup kits for their homes to be able to kind of get them kickstarted on that road to recovery.
Emily, what do you mean by opening cases?
Yeah, so part of what our disaster team does in a larger scale event like this is we look at damage, right? Which might look different from terrace towers to the floods. And so we go out, as Rebecca does on our disaster action team, our wonderful DAT volunteers, and they go out and assess the damage. And based on those damage qualifications, certain residents may qualify for us to open a Red Cross case for them, where we work closely with them. Our casework team, our recovery team, calls them on a consistent basis to follow up and assess those needs that they might have and continue to get them connected with certain resources at certain parts in their recovery that are really important to kind of kickstart that for them and get them on that road.
Great, thanks. Thanks for explaining that. The Red Cross has been sending disaster workers, mostly volunteers like Rebecca, continuously throughout 2023 to respond to disasters across the country and even out of the country. Jeff Mann of Stark County went to Guam following a typhoon there in May. There he is at the Akron-Canton Airport on his way to Guam. Rick McCullough and Arden Tohill grabbed a disaster response vehicle. I'm sorry, not Arden, that's Al Irwin. They rode down to Florida after Hurricane Idalia struck Florida. And then came the devastating, deadly wildfires in Hawaii. The American Red Cross is continuing to work tirelessly to deliver compassionate care to the many people who are picking up the pieces there, and offering financial assistance for those who need help recovering and whose primary residences were destroyed or severely damaged due to those wildfires. And Mike, you were there, Emily was there, I was there for that wildfire response. There were thousands of structures that were considered damaged or destroyed, weren't there? Mike, tell us about your role in that disaster response.
Well, Jim, that was obviously a tragedy and still is, as we have close to 7,000 survivors still taking shelter in 35 non-congregate shelters on the island of Maui, where we're feeding them 3 meals a day. So that we've got a long road to go there. My personal responsibility was to not only assist my counterpart, the regional executive, that was somewhat overwhelmed, as you can imagine, with all of the responsibilities associated with a level 7 disaster, but also to help support with the elected officials that were visiting. And obviously, with a storm of that magnitude, this is a picture of myself and Congressman Dave Joyce, who happens to be from Ohio, in our region, actually, but he is the chairman of the House Homeland Security Appropriations Committee, and he and a number of other people, including then the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, were out in Hawaii visiting to determine how best to fund the devastation and to help support the recovery efforts. That's just one of the many things that we do when we have these kind of disasters.
And there were, as you mentioned, more than 7,000 people who were affected by these disasters. Many of whom have stories to tell, but many Red Cross workers were deployed to Hawaii as well. As mentioned, you were there. Emily, I worked with you in the headquarters location, which was in a vacant, I think it was a Forever 21 store in
It
a mall.
was.
And it was a very odd location, but it worked. We made it work. And you were there. What was your role there, Emily?
Yeah, so when I was in Hawaii, I worked on our workforce team, or staff services, as some may call it. And what my job was to support our volunteers that were on the ground. So I worked to welcome all of our people flying in from over the country to help support the operation, and making sure that those volunteers had what they needed. I worked with our team that was also working with the local community volunteers and event-based volunteers. The community in Hawaii is exceptional and really just stepped up and taught all of us a lot as well. And that was just a very humbling experience to be a part of.
There was Monica Bunner and Randy Lang, two volunteers from the Northern Ohio region, both from the Greater Akron and the Mahoning Valley chapter, who were there in different capacities. Monica was working with community partnerships, and Randy was on the technical side of things. Tim Reichel from our Muskingum Lakes, our Heartland Stark and Muskingum Lakes chapter, working out of Canton, was there helping people register and making sure that they had a safe place to stay. He was in a hotel in Maui there, watching over the residents who were taking refuge in those shelters, which were in some pretty posh hotels. But regardless of the circumstances, they were in non-congregate shelters. For instance, this woman, Tandy Olafson, who is holding her cat, she had been separated from that cat for about 7 days. She fled the fire on a moped. She was able to escape, and then about 7 days later, a neighbor was able to reunite her with the cat. Here she is at the Westin Hotel in Maui, where she took the cat around and was providing comfort to people who just wanted to pet the cat, and it worked. And she was just grateful that she had a place to stay and was waiting with the Red Cross and other agencies to help her develop a path forward. And that's what we need to do. It's work with the state of Hawaii and the federal government and other nonprofits to make sure that these people who have been through so much have some way forward. And Mike, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, thanks, Jim. I appreciate you highlighting, just the scope and breadth of the activities that we've had just so far this disaster season. It's no longer a season. It's really an annual event that starts in January and ends in December. But I would say that these pictures and these stories that you've heard today are very indicative of the fact that we need all the support we can get from our volunteers. We could not meet mission without our volunteers. They're a critical part to everything we do, as well as the generosity of our donors, the people who provide the financial resources so that we can send people to places all over the country to help. It's not cheap to go to Guam, as Jeff Mann will tell you, and it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort. So between, there's a reason the Red Cross's mission is to prevent and alleviate human suffering in the face of emergencies based on the generosity of our donors and the strength of our volunteers. Those two entities, our donors who provide us the resources, and obviously our volunteers who provide us just such an incredible gift of their time and talent. We couldn't do it without them, Jim, and that's what this is all about.
Well said. Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us here. Emily, thank you for taking time out of your busy day. As the regional disaster officer, you're dealing with a lot. And as the mother of 3 young children, you're dealing with a lot. So I appreciate it. And Rebecca, as Mike said, we could not do this without you. So thank you very much for your 4 years of volunteering at the Red Cross. We're looking forward to working with you for many more to come. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.